Hello everybody and welcome to CaiKeys, where today I'm reviewing a washing machine. The Hyundai i10. It's not an objectionable car per se, but what is objectionable is what exactly it represents. You see, the Hyundai i10 came out at a very contentious time, and I'm going to tell you all about it. You see, the Hyundai i10 came out in 2007, and around that time the UK government launched its dreaded scrappage scheme. And what was the number one vehicle that people purchased when they scrapped their cars over 10 years old? This. I've just pulled a list up here of vehicles which were scrapped in the great scrappage scheme of 2009, and what I'm seeing is shocking. One Nissan Skyline Saloon was scrapped, one Nissan Skyline GTST, one Nissan Skyline GTR, and even one Lancia Delta Integrale. So you in 2009 could have thought, my old Skyline, it's seen better days, I'm going to trade it in and get some money on a new car, and you could have driven out of the dealership in one of these. That makes the Hyundai i10 a little bit of the brunt of a joke, but does it make it a bad car per se? Well, absolutely not. The scrappage scheme might appear to be absolute sacrilege, and to us petrol heads it absolutely is. I'm not going to beat around the bush, but when you look at it, for around £8,000 you could have got one of these Hyundai i10s in 2009, but add to the fact that you got £1,000 off the government for scrapping your old jalopy, and you also got at least £1,000 matched by Hyundai, plus you got their unlimited 5-year warranty. It's not any wonder that they sold so many of these. What is it particularly bad? Let's find out. So firstly, for turning the car on, it's a little bit different to a usual car. Firstly, you've got to set your wash temperature. Then you set what kind of cycle you want. I'll put it on funky shirts. And then you set your running speed. There we go. We'll put it on a medium wash. And then we press go. There we go. Cycle engaged. Let's go. So here we are behind the wheel of the Hyundai i10, and the first thing I must say about this car is it's not really the kind of car which I can review in regards to its driving credentials. It drives exactly as you'd expect. We've had quite a few small engined super mini front wheel drive hatchback things on the channel before, and it's pretty much par for the course. It's not a bad thing to drive, it's fairly responsive, but what I do want to talk about in today's video is the surprising cultural impact behind the Hyundai i10. So the Hyundai i10, we first got this for the 2008 model year, and that coincided really well with the UK government scrappage scheme. There's a Reliant Robin there. I'm not going to mention the Aventador that went past, that's far more interesting. Anyway, the UK scrappage scheme, it's an incredibly controversial topic for car enthusiasts. And look, I've just read, Skylines were scrapped, Integrales was scrapped, 3000 GTs, the list goes on, and look, I agree, it's tragic, I weep for it, but the Hyundai i10 was the best-selling car, and the Kia Picanto, which is very similarly related to this, was the best-selling car from the UK scrappage scheme. Is that a bad thing? I do think that the scrappage scheme has really ruined the market for used cars. This topic has been done to death. I can't remember exactly who had a big sit-down video over it. I believe it was Jeff Buys Cars. But if you're interested in that, go and check out one of his videos on the scrappage scheme. It really did. Lots of mid to late 90s cars are very thin on the ground as a result of that. But the Hyundai i10 represents good value for money. You could have bought one of these brand new with no government incentives for about £7,995, £8,000. I struggle to find exact figures, but the thing is, the government would give you a £1,000 grant to purchasing a new vehicle, and Hyundai would match that. Bear in mind that the scrappage scheme came out after the 2008 economic disaster, and we really need to get the economy back on track. So the more money you could spend, the more economic activity you'd have going, win-win. And if you can scrap a few old cars off the road, you can convince people you're doing something good for the environment. You're not. So they sold an awful lot of these Hyundai i10s, but for the average person who purchased one, look, put it this way, if you're not a car enthusiast, you're getting rid of a 10, 15-year-old mid-1990s car, and you're replacing it with something brand new, which people believe brand new cars are reliable, with a really decent warranty for really quite cheap, potentially less than the maintenance involved on an older car. Now, this car came out at a really interesting time for Hyundai as well, not only because the scrappage scheme came out, but also because Hyundai kind of wanted to reinvent themselves. You see, Hyundai weren't really a big player in the market. They came out in the UK longer ago than you'd think. 1982, the Hyundai Pony came out. But really, until the mid-2000s, when potentially Kia started taking off, Hyundais didn't really have a very big following in the UK. Yeah, we had quite a few Hyundai coupes, but the Hyundai Getz and the Hyundai i10s, they kind of had a reputation as maybe a little bit of an old person car, maybe something a little bit, I don't know if rubbish is the right word, but low class, I think. Something a little bit, that BMW's got blood all over it. Something a little bit, say, of a Skoda level. And Hyundai really, with the i10, tried to move a little bit up market. If you look at the Hyundai i10s which preceded it, it was a little bit rubbish. I don't know if you've ever sat in one. They're not the most fantastic place to sit. Perfectly decent cars, fairly reliable, but just a little bit, it's like the old Kia Sedonas, Hyundai Tucsons, the Santa Fe's. The older ones are all a little bit, there's just something missing about them. And Hyundai really, they tried to move up market. Like I've said in the Veloster review, Hyundai tried to, sorry about the clicking, suspension is absolutely knackered. Hyundai tried to show that they could compete with the big boys of Toyota, Honda, and I really think that they did quite well. And interestingly, you can see it again that Hyundai are trying to move even further up market with their recent advertising campaign, so don't call it Hyundai. As an Englishman, I can mispronounce any word I want. It's a right I'm given, and they want us to pronounce it Hyundai now. I believe that is closer to the original Korean pronunciation. Interestingly, when Hyundai first came into the market, they actually launched an advertising campaign, Hi from Hyundai, and actually kind of instructed you to say it, Hyundai. So, Hyundai, you brought it on yourself. Also, what I want to say is really interesting is about this brand perception between different automobiles. I mean, look, Hyundai and Kia, for all intents and purposes, really, I mean, it's the same company, it's the same parent company, and both cars, both car brands, they share an awful lot in common. But I don't know about you, maybe some of your family members, but I mean, I'm going to use the example of my mum. My mum is absolutely convinced that Kias are rubbish cars. She thinks they're shoddily built. She thinks that they're going to break down all the time, that they're made of, cheap Korean sheet metal. Whereas on the other hand, she has quite a positive impression of Hyundais. Maybe it's the same for people who have a certain opinion over Vauxhall, Citroën and Peugeot. Do you know someone who thinks that Vauxhalls are fantastic because they're a British brand, and who thinks that Citroëns and Peugeots are terrible because they're French? Or maybe the other way round. Well, they're the same. Just a little bit of an interesting side thought. So the Hyundai i10 really is the perfect representation of a white goods vehicle. These things, look, they're not bought by enthusiasts. And is that a bad thing, really? To an awful lot of people, a vehicle is just a method of getting from A to B. And look, this car is probably as tall as it is long. It's got a fair bit of body roll, probably due to the now Pro roll bar. And it's not the fastest thing in the world. It's a roughly 65 brake horsepower, 1.2 litre, naturally aspirated Econobox. I've reviewed many of these before. You know exactly what I'm going to say about it. And I don't really have anything negative to say. The negative things that I have to say really are the cultural impact it's had. And there's an awful lot of discussion to be had on whether the scrappage scheme was a good or a bad thing. Look, considering the economic factors at the time, I think that economically it was a smart thing to do. You're getting new cars coming in, you're getting them purchased, but environmentally it was silly. And people said we need to clean up the streets of these old gas guzzlers, these old diesel cars. But time and time again it's been pointed out that it's actually far better for the environment to keep these old cars on the road than to actually manufacture new ones. Yeah, there's a little bit of contention as to whether it's better for the local environment. You know, if you're going around a town centre full of old diesels, then yeah, the air quality is not going to be particularly good. But I really think the environmental argument falls flat on its face. That's something I've also brought up with the genesis of electric cars recently. They're a little bit of a false economy. Regarding this car in particular, check engine light. I don't want to disparage the Hyundai Kappa engine. This has the Kappa engine. It's decent. Hyundai always have a little bit of a mixed reputation with their engines, but as we've discussed, I've discussed this in my previous video, I really think an awful lot of that is due to the Theta engines, mostly sold in America. The 2.4s especially are notorious for failing all over the show. But Hyundai's offerings over in this country have been pretty decent. GDI has a few problems with carbon deposits, but even then, it's not a bad engine by any means. Look at that, Seat Arossa. You might be able to see it behind me. A lime green Seat Arossa. That's a scrappage scheme survivor. I must say, it makes a really good exhaust note for some reason. Like the nicest sounding super mini front wheel drive Econobox washing machine I've ever. For a washing machine, it sounds bloody fantastic. Really not a bad car to drive, actually. But this isn't made for people who drive. I've got to say, for those of you who don't know, I'm an HGV driver. All of the HGVs I drive are limited to 52 miles per hour. Despite that, I don't think I've ever been overtaken by a Hyundai i10, and that's not because they're slow. I mean, they are. Just the type of people who drive them, really. They just tend to be, you know, we'll get there when we get there. Quite chilled out people, and that's not particularly a bad thing. Quite a scene over in India for modifying these vehicles, and fair enough, you know, the thing is, these work really well in urban environments, and I imagine in India these things sell like hotcakes. You've got, you know, an awful lot of people, especially in cities. Something very short and tall and practical must work fantastically over there. This has AC and it blows ice cold. But yeah, in India you get a fair few of these which are like, you know, they'll throw modifications on them that look like they've rolled through Halfords, and that's a car culture that I think we should really get behind. Love of the humble Econobox, because in countries like the UK we drive these things into the ground. I have it on good authority that the oil in this vehicle has not been changed in potentially 25,000 miles. I don't know if that's just Jack exaggerating and being a little bit mean to his dad, but he's not really a car guy. And this is the kind of car that a non-car guy owns. You say, why do you like it? Well, it gets him from A to B. Has it been reliable? He's had a few gear issues. He's had a clutch fail, and one time the gearbox decided to not work. But aside from that, you know, you can kind of expect things to go wrong in a car. They're not infallible. It's been a pretty decent vehicle. I think that's all most people want. Here's an interesting one though. They couldn't sell a car like this really anymore, and I know they still make the Hyundai i10, but here's the thing, and this more so pertains to the Hyundai i10, which came prior to it. The Hyundais like this, cars like this, represent a certain part of the motor industry that doesn't really exist, and that really is the base spec Econobox. And I say that because, look, when Dacia first came out onto the UK market in the late 2000s, you could spec a Dacia Sandero in base spec for £5,995 and it would not come with a radio. And even until about 2015 or so, really, you could purchase cars which really were really bloody basic. Try purchasing a Dacia without a radio. Now, it can't be done. The fact of the matter is, people want luxury, people want something quite nice, and even, you know, Volkswagen Ups, they have Bluetooth, Apple CarPlay, even as a standard feature, more so a tablet on wheels. And this is a comment that I see an awful lot of people on the channel making. They don't make cars anymore, which are just cars, something simple to get you from A to B. Quite frankly, the market doesn't exist. People don't want it. If people wanted a car that could get you from A to B, you'd have been able to purchase a car that got you from A to B. But you can't. There's a red light and then there's that. He ran that about 5 seconds because I turned when my light was on red. Oh, silly people, man. I've got to say, you could even see it with Kia when Kia rebranded with the KN logo, which is essentially incomprehensible. There was actually a massive Google search, what are KN cars? Because they didn't do very well with that rebrand, did they? But people know what they are now. And I really do think they managed to shift that Kia of old. You can actually see it an awful lot, and it brings up a whole other discussion of other car manufacturers bringing out other specs, you know, other brands which, you know, they've got quite a premium reputation already. Look at Seat, Volkswagen Audi Group with the Cupra. I mean, Cupra is essentially a subsidiary of Seat, which is now its own brand. There's so many of these car brands, and you actually look into it, and there's actually about 3 or 4 parent companies. I mean, lots of this, there's a lot of criticism to be had about the homogenization of vehicles, and an awful lot of it is because there's only really a few parent companies. People want to play it safe. Should have indicated. No indication. That does my head in. I'm going to cover the people's insistence on luxury an awful lot in a documentary which I am making. So if you're kind of interested in this topic of what people want from cars and what people don't want from cars, stay tuned because I've got a couple of very interesting theories. Bump bump. Bump bump. Must say, despite the fact there's no anti-roll bars, body roll compared to the Toyota Yaris is, I mean, it's better on this. It's more controlled, it's more manageable. Every time I get into a hatchback, I say how it's a better car than the Yaris. It's not to say that I don't like the Yaris, but I'm saying that driving dynamics of it are essentially non-existent. Bump, bump. Oh, God. As far as character goes with this car, though, and I think this is people's main criticism of the scrappage scheme, not only did we lose lots of older cars, which, you know, they're a piece of history, it's also the fact that these are soulless. And yeah, they are. This car is a washing machine. But is that such a bad thing? I realise that this seems like absolute sacrilege. And yes, I'm sad that an awful lot of classics were scrapped unceremoniously. It is terrible, but is there anything wrong really with non-car enthusiasts having such vehicles? Because we can whinge and complain about the fact that everybody now is driving a Vauxhall Crossland. I agree, they're dreadful things to drive, but the average person does not maintain their car particularly well. They do not care about driving dynamics. All they want is a car that gets them from A to B, is ideally high up, and has a fair few creature comforts. And that's what most cars are right now. There's still a few manufacturers who cater to the enthusiasts, and I've seen the argument made that even economy hatchbacks of the olden days, and that makes me feel old, and I'm only 24, makes, you know, like the Mark 6 Fiesta, even as late as that, the Mark 5 Fiesta, they had something fun about them, they had something redeemable. And yeah, I agree, old cars are more fun, generally. They're lighter, they're more chuckable, there's less electronic driving aids. But look, ultimately, car manufacturers chase profit over everything. That's why they share so many parts. That's why they have a variety of different 1 litre 3-cylinder engines which are cheap to produce and are functionally all the same. It's all about profit. And I'm sorry to say, but in most cases, with very, very few exceptions, I keep on going down every dead end today, and I don't know why I'm doing that. Probably just to show how manoeuvrable the thing is. With very, very few exceptions, car manufacturers have always chased profit. And yes, there's silly little projects they'll do, like let's shove a V5 into a Volkswagen Golf, or let's shove a 3.6 V6 into a Volkswagen Transporter, which I believe they did for some reason. It's always about, let's build the cheapest thing we can for the most profit. And yeah, it's wrong, but that's what you get. So really, with this video, it's essentially a discussion as opposed to an actual road test review. What do you think? Firstly, of the scrappage scheme, I think lots of us can agree that it's wrong. It was a disaster, but I can kind of understand why they did it. It was all for profit. But secondly, what do you think of cars like this? Cheap cars which don't really have any character per se, but they'll get you from A to B. They're pretty reliable and they're cheap to maintain. Do you think that there's a place for these? Or do you think that everyone really should be hooning about the place in Golf GTIs? It's like the Almira review, this. I'm really quite struggling. Oh, God. So there you have it, the Hyundai i10. A far more important car than you might initially think, not because of its fantastic motorsport pedigree, not because of its fascinating performance. No, this car is important because of the period in the motor industry it represents. The UK scrappage scheme, quite possibly one of the worst things that ever happened. But this isn't a car for any one particular subset of people. It's a car for the young, it's a car for the old. It is a washing machine of a car, it's a white good, and I think that in this world there really is a place for the humble Hyundai i10. So thank you for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.